Hello guys, welcome back to another Design 500 video. Today I'm going to be doing something a little bit outside my comfort zone. I'm going to be reacting to a video here. It's called Timeline of Canadian Political Parties by Useful Charts. I think this might be a very interesting way to visualize Canadian history through the lens of which parties have shaped Canada. And from the way it looks like the party on top is going to be the party that's in power. So I think that's what he's doing here. So let's get into this video.
Hi, this is Matt Baker. Last year, prior to the US election, I made this video in which I talked.
Okay, so I think this would be a very interesting video to do as well. But obviously I don't do reactions very much, so I don't know how this is going to go. But if this goes well, I think I might as well step into this one because this looks a lot more detailed than this one looks for sure.
About the history of US political parties. Well, this month we're having an election up here in Canada, and therefore...
Okay, so I guess this was a couple months ago because we're obviously not having an election in October. We had an election back in April. So this must be a couple months old. I might have watched this video before. I'm not 100% sure. I don't remember. I have a very bad memory for remembering videos. So this would make reactions very easy. But anyways, back into this video.
Where I thought I'd make a similar video covering the history of Canadian political parties. For the US video, I mostly used this really cool hand-drawn vintage chart. But since there wasn't an equivalent available for Canada, I had to design my own chart. Although
Okay, I see. Yeah, and it looks pretty good. It looks good for someone who I presume has no experience with this, but it's a very good chart.
Tried to make it look somewhat similar to the US one. So in today's video, I'll be explaining how the very first political parties in Canada were formed, how others arose.
I also like that it's got the PC Progressive Conservatives and the Modern Conservatives under a different color because people are very, very eager to say that the Progressive Conservatives and the Conservatives of today are the same Conservatives. Not necessarily. But yes, I mean, a lot of progressive conservatives did become conservatives, but there were some who didn't and remained independent. Like Joe Clark, for example, was a progressive conservative. He led the party in the 2000 election. But as of 2003, he's an independent. So I think it's good that we change the names, especially since the conservatives bonded together from the Canadian Alliance and the progressive conservatives.
Rose but then vanished, and then finally how some of those older parties led to the creation of the ones that are still around today.
Okay, so it's actually raining really hard here, so if you hear rain in the background, it's because it's raining really hard. But anyways, that doesn't relate to this video. Let's get back into the video.
Now take a look at the timeline of Canadian political parties. It starts in 1867 because, well, that's when Canada became a country.
Well, I mean, I know in the strictest sense, yes. But Canada becoming a country? Like, what do you mean by that? Obviously, we got our first prime minister in 1867, but we had premiers before then. We confederated in 1867, but we didn't gain independence until 1982. So when does Canada become a country? That's a great question. Also, I'd like to point out this over here. How we have the Parti Bleu and the Parti Rouge. Bleu is spelled wrong. There's no A in bleu in French. And the Tories and the Grits in Ontario. I like this. And the Anti-Confederates. I mean, yeah, they were around before 1867. But, I mean, obviously, they were more important before 1867 than after 1867. But I think this is a great way to visualize how we got conservatives, how we got liberals. It's because of the Tories and the Parti Bleu and the Grits and the Parti Rouge.
Initially, Canada had only 4 provinces, the 2 big ones being Quebec, which was and still is mostly French-speaking because it had previously been the core part of New France, and Ontario, which was and is mostly English-speaking because it had primarily been settled by former Americans who had moved there after U.S. independence in order to stay loyal to Great Britain.
Yes, it was settled primarily by Americans, but the British were also here before the Americans were here, so that's how we got a lot of British speaking. But the French were also in Ontario, so there is still a big community of French speakers in Ontario, Same in New Brunswick. I went on a trip to the East Coast this summer, and I was stopped in New Brunswick, and there was a town or a city. They spoke French, even though we were in New Brunswick, which is not Quebec, right? New Brunswick, you'd think English, but it's actually split half and half, and I stayed in the French part in New Brunswick. It's very interesting.
In Quebec, the two main political parties had been the Parti Bleu, meaning the Blue Party, and the Parti Rouge, meaning the Red Party. Whereas in Ontario, the two main parties had been the Tories and the Grits. Since the Parti Bleu and the Tories were both right-leaning, they merged to form the Conservative Party. And since the Parti Rouge and the Grits were both left-leaning, they merged to form the Liberal Party. This explains why, in Canada to this day, Conservatives use blue and Liberals use red.
Yeah, and I mean, mostly all across the world, that's the same thing. Where people on the left, or the party on the left, use the red color, and on the right, they use the blue color. And to an American, that's kind of shocking. They're like, what? Our right-leaning party uses red. And the whole history of that is because it just kind of stuck that way. But in Canada, we've actually been using blues for conservatives and reds for liberals pretty much since we confederated. We hadn't really had that later happen to us like the Americans. Before, in America, when election results came, they would say, oh, this color is Democrat, this color is Republican. It wasn't like, oh, red must be Republican. But we did this pretty much right away.
It also explains why the Conservatives are sometimes still called Tories, and the Liberals...
Yeah, but also in Britain they're called the Tories. So that... Yeah, I know what you're trying to say, but in Britain they're still called Tories as well.
Liberals are still sometimes called Grits.
Personally, I've never heard that. I've never heard the Liberals referred to as Grits. I guess more... Some people might still use that, and I would understand why, but I'm a registered member of the Liberal Party of Canada, and I've never heard Grits been used.
Now, the other two original provinces in Canada were Nova Scotia and New Brunswick. Their politicians joined either the Conservatives or the Liberals, although initially there was a large group from Nova Scotia that didn't want to join Canada, so they became known as anti-Confederates. Some of them actually won seats in the first election, but since by...
Yeah, actually, they won all the seats in Nova Scotia except for one. And the one seat that didn't vote for the anti-Confederates in Nova Scotia actually went to Sir Charles Tupper, who had been the premier of Nova Scotia going into Confederation. He would eventually go on to serve as Canada's shortest-serving prime minister.
Then, Confederation was already a done deal. The Anti-Confederation Party quickly disbanded, with its...
Most of their members ended up joining the Conservatives. In fact, the leader, Joseph Howe, joined the Conservative cabinet under Macdonald.
Members joining either the Conservatives or the Liberals.
Yeah, some of them did join the Liberals, of course, but most of them did join the Conservatives.
Now, on this chart, the winning party is always shown on top. So, as you can see, it was the Conservatives who won the first election, with their leader, Sir John A. Macdonald, becoming Canada's very first Prime Minister.
Yes, the Conservatives did win the first election, and Sir John A. Macdonald was the first Prime Minister, but Sir John A. Macdonald had been Prime Minister before the election. So we had Macdonald come in as Prime Minister of Canada on the 1st of July, 1867, but the election wasn't held until like August. And it had spun a couple of months. We didn't have it till August, so technically, yes, but Macdonald had already been serving as Prime Minister.
These days, he's a controversial figure, because although he helped build the country, he was also responsible for creating the Indian residential school system, which has been described as an attempt at cultural genocide against Canada's Indigenous peoples. Now, an important thing for my American viewers to understand is that Canadians do not vote directly for a prime minister.
This is so important to hammer down. Canadians don't vote for the prime minister. We vote. I'm sure he's going to talk about it, so I might as well just not explain it.
Instead, we vote for a local representative to represent our area in the national parliament. These representatives, which we call MPs, meaning members of parliament, usually belong to a particular political party. And therefore, what happens is, whichever party wins the most seats in the parliament, their leader gets to be the prime minister. Now, there are some exceptions to this.
There are definitely some exceptions on this, and I'm actually working on a video right now talking about the largest exception in history to this rule in Canadian history. But also, we vote this way as well for the provincial elections. We wouldn't call them members of parliament here in Ontario. We call them members of provincial parliament. But in Newfoundland, for example, members of the House of Assembly or something like that. So it's something different, but it's this. We still vote the same way. In America, you vote for the president 50 different times. You got the Electoral College. But in the state, it's like whoever gets the most votes wins, period. So it's very interesting that we keep it kind of similar. But then with the mayoral elections, we don't even have political parties. I think that's very, very interesting because when I heard in Britain, in the mayoral elections at all of these different parties, I was very surprised.
Which I'll point out later. The other big difference I want to point out is that Canada does not have scheduled elections every 4 years like the US does. Instead, the Canadian Prime Minister can call a federal election at any time during his or her term.
And they would have to be accepted by the Governor General. But actually before, a couple of years ago, I think 2000 and something, 2007, we could have it every 5 years. In fact, we had a 1993 election 5 years after 1988. And actually the second election in 1872 was 5 years after our first election in 1867. But we since signed a law that says only 4 years now.
And sometimes an election is even forced in cases where the leading party does not hold 50% of the seats, and therefore the other parties can decide to topple the government.
Yes, but we haven't seen that, at least for a while. I mean, yeah, in 2011. There's definitely times of this in Canadian history, don't get me wrong, but it's much more common to just for it to be called if it's in the middle of a term. We saw that in 2021 when Justin Trudeau called an election. It wasn't forced or anything. He just thought he didn't have a big enough majority.
Okay, so as you can see, the Conservatives dominated for the first...
Sorry, he didn't have a majority. He had a minority. He didn't think he had enough seats. My bad. I'm completely sorry.
29 years, with the Liberals only gaining power for 4 years.
Yes, 4 years, but Mackenzie was thrown in as Prime Minister in 1873 because MacDonald resigned after the scandal that had happened. I think it was something about the railways. I forgot the actual name of the scandal, of course, now that I'm making this video. But I made a video about it a couple years ago. I think it was 2024 I made a video about this, which was not a couple years ago. That was last year. Anyways, Mackenzie lost the election of 1878, but that was early in January. So yeah, it was November 1873 to January 1878 where Mackenzie and the Liberals were in power. And then look at this, they don't come back for a long time.
Under the leadership of the second Prime Minister, Alexander Mackenzie. In Canada, there is no limit to how many times a Prime Minister can serve. So Macdonald served for almost 19 years, both before and after Mackenzie. In fact, he died while still in office.
He was only the first out of 2 Prime Ministers in Canadian history to have died in office. We have not had another Prime Minister die in office since 1894 with John Thompson, who was the second one over here.
A stroke at age 75. At this point, the Conservatives had to quickly choose a new leader, and hence a new Prime Minister, because unlike in the US, there's no system in place for who automatically takes over. Canada thus got a series of 4 very short-serving Conservative Prime Ministers, none of whom were actually elected. You see, Abbott got sick and had to retire. Thompson died in office from a heart attack at age 49. Bowl was unpopular and was forced to resign. And Tupper, well, he lost the next election to the Liberals.
He did lose, but he won the popular vote. And that was the first time in Canadian history the winner of the popular vote didn't win the most amount of seats. And this actually gave Tupper the idea in his mind, oh, I didn't actually lose this election, I'm going to contest this. So he refused to accept the election results. He tried to pass through some cabinet members, and they were struck down by the Governor General. So he was forced into resigning, and Laurier took office.
Liberals, who were now led by Sir Wilfrid Laurier. That election was a major turning point, because ever since then, the Liberals have been the dominant party. From 1896 to today, they've held power 75% of the time, which
That is an insane number. 75% of the time since 1896. In a complete and fair democracy, how many times do you see one party holding on to power 75% of the time in the past 129 years? You don't really see that. The Liberals are called Canada's natural governing party, and it's clearly not for nothing because we keep electing Liberals. We really only elect Conservatives when we're tired of the Liberals. And actually, Conservatives tend to last longer than Liberal prime ministers. So, if you look at the longest served Canadian prime ministers, most of them are Conservative, with a couple of exceptions, like Laurier, who's the longest serving consecutive prime minister, and Mackenzie King, who's the longest served, period. But, like, McDonald's up there, and Stephen Harper's up there, and Brian Mulroney's up there, because they all served pretty long when we got tired of the Liberals.
is why they are sometimes referred to as Canada's natural governing party. They did not, however, hold power at the start of World War I, which led to an interesting situation. You see, during that war, there was a major debate over whether or not Canada should conscript soldiers. The governing Conservatives, led by Sir Robert Borden, were pro-conscription, but the Liberals were divided on the issue, mostly along language lines. Thus, during the election of 1917, most of the English-speaking Liberals temporarily joined the Conservatives to form a unionist government, while
I think it's the story of Canadian history that everything is on language lines. Actually, for most of history, Quebecers are Liberals. Like, most of the time they vote Liberal, they're left-leaning. And there are some conservative Quebecers, obviously. But ever since really Laurier and the two conscription crises, most of them are from the Liberals. And just look at this mess here we have in the 1920s. In most countries, they would just skip over the 1920s because it's just not that important. But here in Canada, the 1920s are a very important time. Just look at the progressives. They have like 155 different lines coming out of them. It's so interesting, the 1920s in Canadian history. The King Byng affair. It's all over the place in the 1920s.
most of the French-speaking Liberals remained separate. After the war, Borden retired, resulting in another unelected and short-serving Prime Minister, Arthur Meighen. Now, up until this point, Canada basically had a two-party system, which is what
We always have. Obviously, even before this. I mean, we only had two parties before this. And it's either the Liberals or Conservatives in first and second. With some, of course, huge exceptions like 2011 and when the PCs fell off. But we really do have a two-party system. Sometimes I've heard it called a two-party plus system because there's only two parties that will win and a couple of other parties that will gain seats like the NDP and the Bloc. So I think I can get more... I'm on board with the two-party plus system.
why either the Conservatives or the Liberals were almost always able to win a majority. However, starting with the end of World War I, that all changed. And ever since then, Canada has had a multi-party system.
Well, a multi-party system, yeah, but when you think of a multi-party system, don't you think that means that there's multiple parties that can form government? Because Germany definitely has a multi-party system. Canada, I don't know. Until we see the NDP form government once, then I'll say multi-party. Right now, if you want to say multi-party, technically we have multiple parties, so you can go and say that. I'm going to stick with two-party plus system because I think that represents Canada the most.
Multi-party system, the winning party sometimes wins less than 50% of the seats, and thus has to try and cooperate with smaller parties in order.
And we have that right now. That's called a minority government. We have a minority government, but sometimes it's called a governable minority when it's like 3 seats off, which it is now. Mark Carney has 169 seats out of 172. So it's called a governing majority because he can pretty much govern it like he has a majority. He can get everything passed. But if it's like very, very tight, right, there's a chance that you have to work with the other parties. 2021, the Liberals worked with the NDP to get stuff done. And that's not the only time in Canadian history where two parties work together. Absolutely, it isn't.
To stay in power, something that's called a minority government. This happened to the Liberals for the first time in 1921. That's because that's the year that a sizable third party arrived on the scene for the first time.
Well, it depends on what you mean by sizable, because if sizable means party that can have a chance of winning, then no. But if you mean by having more than 10 seats consistently, then yeah. But I mean, look at the United Farmers down here. United Farmers had been around for a while. And so had the Labour Party, but they didn't gain much seats. So I'll stick with that.
It was called the Progressive Party, and it mostly grew out of the United Farmers Movement, which wanted more free trade with the U.S.
Well, yeah, I mean, all progressives were United Farmers. There was a United Farmer Party alongside the progressives, but most of the United Farmers became progressives. But there were also a lot of liberals who became progressive because they felt the Liberal Party needed to be more progressive. I mean, think about it. In 1912, the Progressive Party under Theodore Roosevelt in the United States did super well. And being Canadians, we always get inspired by the States, and we do our own things based off the States. So we created the Progressive Party. And they actually were very short-lived. And because everyone, they had the same idea, be progressive. But how should we be progressive? So it kind of blew up in a million pieces and led into the Liberals, the Conservatives, right? The Socreds and the Cooperative Commonwealth. And they actually got second in the 1921 election, but refused being called leader of the opposition because they were just so fractured they couldn't hold on to it.
However, it also attracted several Liberal MPs who had been a part of the wartime Unionist Party. The result was that the Progressive Party was not very united. What joined them together was that they all wanted change, i.e. progress, but they didn't necessarily agree on what that progress would look like. This is why the short-lived Progressive Party eventually led to both the creation of a new left-wing party as well as the creation of a new right-wing party. But I'm getting ahead of myself. First of all, I want to point out that the Liberal Prime Minister at this point was William Lyon Mackenzie King, the man who would go on to become Canada's longest-serving Prime Minister. He, together with Borden, Laurier, and Macdonald, are the four Prime Ministers who have appeared on Canadian currency.
That's absolutely true, but he's coming off Canadian currency. Mackenzie King is because we're putting Terry Fox on the 5, which currently Laurier is on the 5, and Laurier's going to go on the 50. Which, honestly, I think we should take off Laurier and keep Mackenzie King, personally. But first of all, we need to get rid of Borden, because he's my least favorite Prime Minister. I made a whole video about why I hate him last year as well. Please go check it out, because I don't want this video becoming too long.
Mackenzie King is on the $50 bill. Borden is on the 100. Laurier is on the 5, and Macdonald was, until very recently, on the 10. He's since been replaced by Viola Desmond, who is sometimes called the Rosa Parks of Canada. Anyhow, two unique things happened during Mackenzie King's first term. First of all, even though the Progressives actually won more seats than the Conservatives were given the role of official opposition, something that is usually reserved for second place. This is because the Progressives, who, remember, were not very united, didn't want the title. Secondly, in 1926, the Conservative leader, Arthur Meighen, became Prime Minister again.
This story is so interesting. I hope he goes into it a little bit. I'm making a video right now about the most unstable time in Canadian history, which will be happening probably on the 29th, because that's actually Election Day 100 years ago. So stay tuned for that.
Be it very briefly, even though his party didn't have the most seats. This is a rare...
Actually, no, he did. His party did have the most seats. In the 1925 election, Arthur Meighen got more seats than the Liberals, but the Liberals continued to govern because them and the Progressives were together, along with some United Farmers. But it's the Liberals and the Progressives that worked together to keep Mackenzie King in power. But that deal fell apart because, again, the progressives were not very united. So Min did have more seats. He's actually, when he came back, he lasted 3 days. It's the shortest time span of actual governance in Canadian history.
Thing that can happen in case of a minority government, because when the first place party loses a vote of confidence, sometimes another party is given the chance to govern instead of an election being called. But,
well, not really. I haven't seen that happen ever. I mean, yes, technically it happened 100 years ago, but yeah, it's just not, that's not really what happens.
as you might have guessed, what happened was that the Conservatives also lost a vote of confidence, and thus an election was called anyway. This time, Mackenzie King was able to get above 50% because several progressives, who became known as liberal progressives, agreed to support him. Around the same time, a different group of progressives formed what was called the Ginger Group.
If you want to learn more about the Ginger Group, I literally just posted a video about it last week. I highly suggest you watch it. The Ginger Group is very fascinating.
This was not an official party, but rather a sort of coalition that combined socialist-leaning progressives with similarly minded United Farmers, as well as a few MPs from a small party known as the Independent Labour Party. If we move forward to 1935, you'll see that the Ginger Group ended up forming a new party, which was called the Cooperative Commonwealth Federation, or CCF.
The leader of the CCF, or the Cooperative Commonwealth Federation, was J.S. Woodsworth, whom was unofficially the leader of the Ginger Group, and was officially the leader of the Independent Labour Group. He was involved in the 1919 strike in Winnipeg. He's if you're a socialist or someone who's very interested in workers' rights, you will love J.S. Woodsworth.
CCF. It was definitely left-wing and aligned with a political philosophy called democratic socialism. However, at the same time, another new party was established, called the Social Credit Party, or SOCREDS for short. It too drew from former progressives, but was more socially conservative and right-wing.
So actually, this part's very interesting because for the longest time here, you have two parties on the left, the Liberals in the center left, and the Cooperative Commonwealth Federation, later the NDP, further to the left to push the Liberals more to the left. And the Progressive Conservatives on the right, and the Social Credit Party even further to the right, later the Ralliement Crediste Party, further to the right, to push the Conservatives more to the right. So it's very interesting, and it's not surprising at all when you get election results like 1957, where Diefenbaker beats St. Laurent by 7 seats, or in 1972 when Trudeau beats Robert Stanfield by 2 seats. It's not at all that hard to imagine this time being unstable. In fact, 1957 to 1968 is it's a pretty unstable time. Diefenbaker being in any power kind of just essentially made it unstable. Not to diss Diefenbaker, but he came in as leader of the Conservatives in the mid-50s and left in the mid-70s. Exactly the same, or mid-60s. Exactly the same time frame of Canada's being the most unstable since the 1920s.
Thus, for the next 50 years, Canada basically had 4 main parties. The Liberals, center-left, and the Conservatives, center-right. But also the CCF, which was even more to the left, and the Socred Party, which was even more to the right. It should be noted, however, that only the Liberals and the Conservatives ever held power.
Yeah, and that's just the story with anytime you see a third party in Canada, it's either the Liberals or the Conservatives in power. Don't worry about these other parties. They're not going to hold power, ever, really.
I should also point out several important name changes.
Yes, the name changes, because the PC party, the Progressive Conservatives, and the old and even the new Conservatives are often mixed together, and I hate saying that because they're not. The Progressive Conservatives and the old Conservatives, yes, the old Conservatives did become Progressive Conservatives and no one else became Progressive Conservative, but R.B. Bennett, who was the last Conservative Prime Minister, and Diefenbaker, the first Progressive Conservatives, were completely different in everything. So I just think it's good to call out the name changes here. And of course, also in the 1960s with the CCF and the NDP, but I don't want to get too far into that.
1942, the Conservative Party changed its name to the Progressive Conservative Party, or PC Party for short. That happened mostly because their leader at the time had previously been a member of a provincial Progressive Party. So strangely, the Progressive label ended up living on through the Conservatives.
Yeah, and if you think about it, progressive conservative is kind of an oxymoron, of course, because conservatives aren't progressive at all. It's like literally the complete opposite. But it's very fascinating how that came to be.
Another big change occurred in 1961 when the CCF was dissolved and replaced by the NDP.
I don't know if I would use the word dissolved, but the CCF isn't around anymore. I guess I would maybe, but I don't know. It feels like the word dissolved means like everyone in the CCF decided to leave and then magically decided to join the NDP, which is not what happened.
Which stands for the New Democratic Party. To this day, they use the color orange. Their first leader was Tommy Douglas, the most famous Canadian politician to never actually serve as Prime Minister.
Absolutely. 100%. Or I would give that title to him or either George Brown, because these two are just quintessentially important Canadian figures. Douglas, of course, says here, father of Canadian healthcare. Without Douglas, we might not get Canadian healthcare the way we do until a little bit later. But it's nice we got it in the 60s when we did.
The reason why he's so famous and well liked is because he helped to introduce free healthcare to all of Canada. As for the Socreds, well, they actually split for a while along language lines.
They split for the rest of the... Well, I guess technically they split for a while in the sense that there was a Social Credit Party running in English Canada and a Ralliement Crediste in Quebec. But after a while, Ralliement Crediste became the Social Credit Party, and there was a party called Social Credit, but they only ran in Quebec and got very few seats.
From 1963 to 1973, with the French faction being called the Ralliement Creditiste. They never did recover from that split, though, and by the 1980s, they were no longer represented in Parliament. This left Canada with only 3 parties, but only for about a decade, because...
Yeah, only about a decade, but it's very fascinating to only see in Canadian politics 3 parties, the Liberals, the PCs, and the NDP. That's the closest we got since before World War I to just having Liberals and Conservatives. So I'm glad that we had the NDP to make sure that neither one of these parties pushed their boundaries too far.
In 1993, the political landscape in Canada underwent its biggest change yet.
Calling it a change is an understatement, because just what happened in 1993 was insane. Of course, the Liberals got so many seats, they won a majority. The PCs, they fell off. They got 2 seats in the whole of Canada. They were very unpopular with Mulroney and Campbell. Reform got most of the seats in the west of Canada because the Western Canadians who voted PC felt alienated, and we see that a lot today. Western alienation in Canada. We just have needed and still need to do a better job with Western Canada to make them not feel alienated. Right, we don't want half the country feeling alienated. And think about all those resources in Alberta, right? We don't want them leaving Canada. So they voted Reform to get more representation. They became the Alliance, merged with PC. The NDP fell off. They had Alexis McDonald as their leader and completely fell off. They did not do much better than the PCs. And the Bloc Québécois, because Quebec also felt alienated by Mulroney's failures. The Bloc Québécois was created to represent Quebecers. They've never held power. They literally can't, unless literally the other 5 parties, major parties that is, gets like 60 seats, and because Quebec has like 70 something seats, and the Bloc gets all those. But it's very, very unlikely. Very unlikely.
Now, in order to explain that change, I first of all have to explain the importance of the year 1982 when it comes to
1982 is a massive year, and I very regret that so many Canadians will look at 1982 and skip it, because patriation made Canada Canada. We became independent from Britain. April 17th needs to be recognized as a national holiday, honestly, for what happened on April 17th, 1982.
Canadian history. Although 1867 is generally understood to be the year that Canada was born, it could also be argued that the actual year that Canada was born was 1982. You see, up until that point, the British Parliament still had the power to pass laws that could apply to Canada, and it still had the power to amend the Canadian Constitution. In fact, up until 1977, Canadians were still referred to as British subjects.
Yes, that's true, and honestly, I don't see what's wrong with that. Obviously, it's very colonialist, but if the king is our leader, and we have two national anthems, and one of them is God Save the King, why shouldn't we be allowed to apply for the benefits that British citizens get, right?
Until 1965, this was the official flag of Canada. You might have thought that it was this one, but that one was technically just a nautical flag.
Yeah, but like everyone used this anyways, so technically unofficial, but practically official, if you know what I mean. But yeah, an unofficial flag. But look what's in the top left corner even of this unofficial flag. We were very British.
The point is, it took a long time for Canada to actually become fully independent from Great Britain, and in fact, the process was not completed until April 17th, 1982. On that day, Queen Elizabeth II signed the Canada Act, which amended the Canadian Constitution, making it Canada's and Canada's only. It did not, however, make Canada a republic.
And we are still not a republic. And we have the king as our leader. We vote for the prime minister. If we remove the king, I know a lot of people are like, why should we have the king? Most Canadians are actually in favor of removing the king. But we don't really care about that. I personally think we need to keep the king because I don't think the leader... I guess I'm a constitutional monarchist because the leader of the country shouldn't have very much power. It's how I see it. So I'm glad that even if there should really be a Canadian, that the leader doesn't have much power.
Today, Canada still shares a monarch with the UK and several other countries. But here's the thing. By this point, Canada now consisted of 10 provinces. After much negotiation, 9 out of those 10 were happy with the new constitution.
And look which one isn't. It's always Quebec that is the outlier in Canada. And this creates a lot of problems for Mulroney in the 1980s and 90s.
But one was not, Quebec. You see, Quebec has always been a bit different from the rest of Canada because they are primarily French-speaking and have a history that goes back farther than most other parts of Canada. On one hand, this didn't really matter because the new constitution became the law of the land anyway. But on the other hand, it mattered a great deal because there was a growing movement in Quebec to separate from Canada and become...
And this is the very first time you have a lot of Quebec separatism. In the 1940s, there was the Parti Québécois, which, Parti Québécois, right? But they got, 4 seats in the whole country? So they didn't really do very much. They disbanded pretty much immediately. So you don't really have to worry about Quebec separatism until this. And we've had it ever since. The October Crisis in 1970, which was a little bit before this. Huge deal, Quebec separatism. But that was more on the fringe in 1970.
Its own country. Thus, in 1984, the Conservative leader, Brian Mulroney, ran on a promise to Quebec that he would help amend the Constitution in a way that they could be happy with. This resulted in the biggest landslide win in Canadian history.
No, it didn't. Yes, it got the most amount of seats. 211 seats is the most. But Diefenbaker had got 208 seats in 1960 or 1958 and got like 70 something percent of the seats, whereas Mulroney didn't get that much. So it's not the biggest landslide in Canadian history.
And Mulroney did carry through on his promise, negotiating a series of proposed changes to the Constitution known as the Meech Lake Accord. But this time, Quebec was happy, whereas several English-speaking provinces were not. And in the end, Meech Lake failed. This resulted in the formation of two new regionally based parties. First, there was the Bloc Québécois, whose expressed goal was to achieve Quebec separation. But there was also...
In the 1990s it was, but nowadays it's more representing Quebec because everyone really knows now Quebec's not getting independence. Quebec is going to be Canadian for a while. So, everyone knows now, no Quebec separatism. So it's just representing Quebec. And also calling reform a regionally based, sure, it got all of its support in the West, but it ran seats even in Nova Scotia. So, not really regionally based.
The Reform Party, based in the West, which was upset that Quebec was getting so much attention, while the Western provinces were not. It was even further to the right than the PC Party, and was founded by the son of a former Socred leader. So, in the 1993 election, the PC Party was now led by Kim Campbell, Canada's only female prime minister to date. But they suffered a colossal defeat, going from 156 seats to just 2. And to everyone's surprise, the Bloc Québécois came in second, with the Reform Party finishing in third. 2 years later...
Not a far third. The Bloc got like 54 seats and Reform got 52. So, not a close third. Or not a far third, sorry, not at all.
A referendum was held in Quebec, and the separatists almost won, achieving 49.4% of the vote. From there, the Bloc went down and the Reform went up, becoming the official opposition and seemingly the new dominant party on the right. But the PC Party was still getting enough support to split the vote on the right, and it became clear that the right would never...
That's actually a great point. The PCs were getting not a lot of seats, but a lot of votes. In 1993, they were third in votes, even if they only got 2 seats. So they were still splitting the vote. Don't think 2 seats so they did nothing. They were getting a lot of votes and making life hell for Reform.
Be able to form government if it remained divided. So efforts were made to unite the right, starting with a rebranding of Reform as the Canadian Alliance, and eventually a full merger, with the new party returning to the Conservative brand, with the Progressive part being dropped. This new Conservative Party came to power in 2006 under...
It is the first time the Conservatives, and actually only time the Conservatives won an election. They won a couple elections, they won 3 elections. It's the first time they've ever had a prime minister, and the only time they've ever had a prime minister, with Paul Martin losing a confidence vote in 2006 and being booted out of office in 2006.
Stephen Harper. And in 2011, the Liberal Party fell to 3rd place for the first.
Yes, that's the first time the Liberals ever fell down to 1st or 2nd, because they had a leader in 2011, Michael Ignatieff, was pretty American, and we don't really like the Americans very much, even throughout history. So we got him out of there. Canadians put them 3rd. The Bloc didn't do good because the Jack Layton was very popular in Quebec, and that's how we got 2nd with the NDP. And the Bloc was not popular because they had the same leader since 1997 or something. So young Quebecois were like, no, I'm not voting for this party. I'm voting NDP for this guy I actually do like. It's very sad. Had Jack Layton not died in 2011, NDP probably could have formed government by now.
First time, with the NDP achieving 2nd place for the first time. In other words, nowadays, Canada truly has a multi-party system, with anyone being able to fall from grace and anyone being able to rise up.
If you put an American as your leader, maybe. But I'm still going to stick with 2-party plus. I made that pretty clear. And this is what we have now in 2025. The Liberals have been in power for a decade, and the Conservatives have been in second for a decade. The NDP have fallen down to fourth, which would have been unimaginable back in 2011, behind the Bloc. And the Greens are there. And there's also the PPC. In 2018, Maxime Bernier left the Conservatives, created his own People's Party, and they got like 0.4% of the vote last election, so they're not doing very well. 2021, they did pretty good, and it was looking like they could have got like 15% of the vote at one time, but they didn't do good at this election.
Since 2011, there's even been a fifth party, the Greens, with a few seats.
Well, the Greens have been around forever, but they got their first seat in 2011, yes.
Which brings us almost up to today. In 2015, the Liberals came back to power under Justin Trudeau, the son of Pierre Trudeau, who had been Prime Minister back in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. This is the only example of father-son Prime Ministers in Canadian history. Justin served for 9 years, but resigned just 2 months ago due to being extremely unpopular, even within his own party. So, as of March 15th, Canada actually has a new Prime Minister, Mark Carney. But one of the first things he did was call an election, which means...
Well, he had to, because the last election was in 2021. Yeah, there was an election scheduled this year, and it was looking like he was going to win a massive majority, and he was 3 seats off from a majority. So, yeah, well, that's what he got. He got 169 seats. If you waited until tomorrow was supposed to be election day, October 20th, if you waited until then, who knows if the Liberals would still be as popular as they were in the spring.
Means that he might not be Prime Minister for long. That's because he's in a tight race with the Conservatives, now led by Pierre Poilievre. Up until recently, the polls indicated that Poilievre would win easily.
They did, and it's an insane turnaround the Liberals made. Absolutely unthinkable that we would have the Liberals in today back in December. Absolutely unthinkable.
But then came this man, who started a trade war with his friendly neighbors, and who even threatened to annex Canada and make it the 51st state. This has led to an unusual wave of patriotism amongst Canadians, and a surge in popularity for the Liberals, now that they have a new leader. Like I said earlier...
And just look at the NDP. Look, they were threatening the Liberals to become official opposition again. Just completely died off. Weak leadership, popular Liberal leader, right? And the popular Liberals now completely died off the NDP. It's if you're a person who belongs to the NDP, you guys really need to find out what the problem is, and you got to hammer down on that problem, because there's no way you could be threatening the Liberals in January and getting 7 seats in April. It's unthinkable.
A lot of people view the Liberals as sort of Canada's default party, and therefore they feel more safe when the Liberals are in power. It certainly helps that the Liberal red matches the red on the Canadian flag, which...
It absolutely does help, right? Again, going back to Canada's natural governing party, Canadians feel more safe with Liberals now that it's the governing party, natural governing party, right? And the red absolutely helps with the maple leaf. Blue, who uses blue? The Americans uses blue. Who is our biggest enemy right now? The Americans. So that's just how it happened this year.
Which, by the way, was adopted when the Liberals were in power. So, as usual, it's probably going to be either the Liberals or else the Conservatives. But what's even more certain is that the Bloc and the NDP will probably see their lowest numbers ever.
No, the Bloc wouldn't have. Even before. The NDP maybe, and they did, right? They got 7 seats lower than they did in 93. But the Bloc, no, they got like 20-something seats. Their lowest is 4. Okay? They were not going to get the lowest amount of seats they've ever gotten.
Meaning that Canada might be heading back to a 2-party system. I guess we'll have to wait and see.
Well, when the third largest party is a separatist party, and fourth has 7 seats. I think it's going to become like that. But anyways, this was a great video. I really liked how it was presented. It's an awesome representation of Canadian history. I strongly suggest you go subscribe to Useful Charts. And yeah, thank you for watching.